Hello again from Mount Carmel. Today I would like to talk about a topic that is actually far too big and overwhelming and deep to put into one short little YouTube clip. So I'm not even going to try to go into any level of the depths of this topic. I'm today just going to really touch upon one very short and very specific point. And the topic that you can see from the title that I'd like to talk about today is the issue of spiritual abuse. And the title is Spiritual Abuse When the Cross is Used as a Weapon. And before I start, I just want to say that in what I'm talking about now, I am not referring to anything that is going on in my own wonderful congregation on the top of Mount Carmel or amongst anyone who I'm serving with at the moment in ministry. I'm talking much more generally about stories that I've heard from many other people, believers around the world, and also things that I've been through in particularly my earlier walk with the Lord. And I'm talking about the topic because I think it's one that is really common and one that a lot of people have been hurt by, sometimes not in very big and dramatic ways, sometimes it's taken much subtler forms, but it's one that doesn't get spoken about as much as it should, and it's something that is important and something that I believe grieves God's heart, and that we can learn to get better in our communities and churches. So the very specific point I'm going to talk about right now is the issue of boundaries, because as I see it, I think a lot of spiritual abuse comes from a misunderstanding of where God has laid his boundary lines. And this thought, as I've been reflecting on it, has taken me back to some amazing chapters at the end of the book of Job, which I'm sure we all know that Job is full of suffering and lamentations and expressions of Job's pain as he goes through so much turmoil and suffering in his life. And just at the very end of the book of Job, God begins to answer. And his answer is absolutely amazing. And I think that God's answer to Job is, for me, the clearest, most beautiful, wisest description of God's own God-given boundaries that he's made for the whole world that I think has ever been written. And I want now just to read a few verses from Job 38, and I'll start from verse 4. This is God as he answers Job. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who set its measurements, since you know, or stretched the line on it? On what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone? When the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy. Now this is verse 8. Or who enclosed the sea with doors? When bursting forth, it went out from the womb. When I made a cloud its garment and thick darkness its swaddling band. And I placed boundaries on it and set a bolt and doors. And I said, thus far you shall come, but no further. And here shall your proud waves stop. That's just a few verses from Job, but the whole passage goes on to talk about God creating the light and the birds and the stars and the morning and the evening, and how he put his perimeters around everything that he created. So in this passage I just read, he's speaking about the waves, and God created the strength and energy and passion of the waves and the roaring sea. But God also put the limits on the sea and said, this is where your proud waves shall stop. And essentially, as I said earlier, I think so much spiritual abuse stems from us simply not understanding where God has put his boundaries. And I think spiritual abuse is such an enormous spectrum, and on one end of the spectrum it can be really something that is very minor, really doesn't cause very much harm, and can happen so easily in the context of just normal, healthy, otherwise loving, functional relationships. For instance, parents don't have time to give their kids much breakfast, get to a service and expect the children to sit still and not complain and not make too much noise and behave beautifully. And when the children start having temper tantrums, the parents can easily say something like, oh, but you're supposed to, the Bible says to obey your parents, or God won't be happy with you behaving like this in a church setting. And really, I mean, I can probably think of times where I've said things like that I regret afterwards, and I think many parents do. But in essence, what it is expecting children to do something that simply, biologically, developmentally, they're simply not able to do. They have their boundaries that God has put around them, the things they can do and the things they simply are not able to do. And to expect them to do more than they're able to do, and to justify that in some sort of theological language, is a very, very light form of spiritual abuse that many of us are guilty of. And as I say, in a normal family, it really doesn't do any damage long term. But then there are the other forms of spiritual abuse. As I say, I think it's a real spectrum, and you do get so many stories on the other end of the spectrum. Well, even in the middle of the spectrum, you get stories. How many believers are so exhausted, burnt out, worn out, have to give up their ministries, have to step back from church because their boundaries, they haven't recognised their own boundaries and others haven't recognised their boundaries. These stories are very, very common in believing communities, again, where often well-meaning people in positions of authority expect a level of service from members of the congregation, and maybe the jobs really have to be done. Maybe there's a real need for the acts of service to be carried out, but it can become spiritual abuse when those leaders in positions of authority say things like, well, God calls you to serve. We're supposed to have a servant heart. We're meant to be Christ-like. We're meant to lay down our lives. And it's very easy to make everything theological and not to see that these members of the community have their boundaries. There are things that, even though they want to be servant-hearted, they are too tired, too worn out, too busy, too exhausted, and they can't do them. And too often we don't see those boundaries. We don't see where God has put those boundary lines. And then, of course, I don't want to go into huge detail now, but there are then the big issues, the really big ones where real abuse is justified theologically in marriages, in church settings, where people suffer untold pain and are told that they should submit because that's God's order, that they should revere those in authority and not question those who are telling them to do things that are painful and unjust. I'm not even going to try to go into all of the complexities and sensitivities of this huge, great big topic, but I do think it's one that needs to be out there, that we need to be aware of, and it's one that probably all of us can grow in and learn something from if we reflect on the boundaries that God has outlined in his word, and especially these ones at the end of the book of Job. I think we can all benefit if we look at the world and we see how when God created it, he put the boundary lines in. He measured everything, and he designed and created every single thing, every single person, with the exact strengths and weaknesses they have, the exact characters and personalities they have. And God has set everything precisely within its own limits. And I think it would do each one of us personally a whole load of good if we can see ourselves within our own limits and don't push ourselves beyond our own limitations. And if we're conscious of those closest to us, those in our own families, those in our communities, if we're in positions of leadership, then those under us pastorally, that in all of our interactions we listen out for those boundary lines that God has put in place, and we're so careful, and we try to be even more careful not to put a foot over the boundaries that God has created. I pray this word has been a blessing to you, and I pray that God will bring and restore his boundary lines across the world and in his body and amongst his believers. Amen.